Hey guys, Jeffrey from Headstrong Training Systems here. So today we're going to be doing something a little bit different again. We're going to be taking a look at programming, and in particular we're going to be talking about establishing frequency. So when constructing a mesocycle, so when you're first writing a block of training for an athlete, how would you establish the frequency of the movement? So squat, your bench, or deadlift. Basically, how often a week would you squat, how often a week would you bench, and how often a week would you deadlift? Now I just want to preface this by saying that this frequency construction is for a mesocycle, so for a block of training, so just like a general acceleration block, and not for a peaking comp into comp block where there might be a manipulation of frequency based on how you taper your athlete specifically. So just wanted to preface this by saying that. So in today's video we're going to be talking about firstly how to establishing a baseline for frequency, so your starting point, where would you go from, and then I'm going to talk about when you might increase frequency, and finally when you might decrease frequency based on the incoming variables and incoming information you're receiving. So when you're first writing and establishing frequency baseline for an athlete, the best and most effective method of establishing a baseline is by looking at their past blocks. Simply, if you go ask your athlete, talk to your athlete, if they've worked with a coach before, or if they used that, because surely they would have trained themselves even if they didn't have a coach. Just basically ask them what they've been doing so far. Ask them what frequency they've been doing, and basically that will act as a very effective baseline, and that will probably guide your prescription into that first block. Often, most of the time, you probably wouldn't need to change anything off that block. Basically, whatever they've been doing, I wouldn't, in that first block that you guys are working together, I will never increase any frequencies, simply because that baseline of what they used to be doing is their tolerance level. That's what they're able to effectively, their body is able to adapt to and make progressions off that. And if you were to increase that frequency without first building a bigger base and increasing the athlete's ceiling, then you're opening that door up for injury. So basically, when you start writing that first block, whatever the athlete has been currently or previously doing will act as a very effective guideline. There may be instances where I might strip back, so basically whatever frequency they're given, I might pull back a bit if I'm looking at based off how the athlete has been traveling. So in terms of if they've been experiencing any niggles, they've been experiencing any pains that can be attributed to the programming that they've been previously doing, or if say they come to me and I can see that their program is something that I don't think that they're able, based off my experience and my anecdotes, so that I don't think that the frequency is something that's currently suitable for them. So say for example they're running 4x bench frequency, but they've got less than a year's training under their belt, and they're like a 66 male, where that amount of frequency in what I've seen in the past and right now, I just don't think it's safe to continue running, even though yes, they might have been running successfully but for a short period of time. And I have a feeling that if we were to keep running that, then we'll be opening the door up to injury. So that's a situation where I might pull back on that frequency despite knowing their baseline. Now, so we talked about if you've got an athlete that already kind of has an idea of what they used to be doing, what their body is able to tolerate. But now say if you have an athlete who's come to you very recently and they don't know what they're capable of doing, they've done training in the past, but it's been a very random, there hasn't been any structure to it, and basically the information that you can pull off that isn't as effective, doesn't give you as much information as you would like it to do. My best piece of advice for coaches who have that kind of athlete is start conservative and build a baseline. And what I mean by that is, if say you start my point is, for an athlete who, if they don't even have that kind of structure to their training and don't know what programming their body best responds to, chances are their training experience is very low, that they haven't been in the sport, they haven't been training for a long time to have established that information. And so what's correlated with that is that you will most likely see progression and adaptation of even very low training stimulus, as in you don't need to give them a huge amount of training volume, training frequency, or of these very complex variations of exercises in order to promote further adaptation, because they're currently in what gym bros would term as the newbie games phase, where any stimulus and any adaptation would stimulus will induce adaptation. And so you will see adaptation, but in that beginning phase, what's most important is playing a conservative, because so that you can build momentum and build build more frequency if needed going to the future. You're essentially trying to build the foundation of the athlete and increasing their ceiling, and ensuring that they can get to the point where you can start to bump up their frequency, and that you're increasing their longevity so that they can remain injury free to get to that point. Because say you start off with an athlete and you smash them with 2x 3x squat, 2x daily frequency of 3-4x bench straight away, and if they don't have that foundation, or if they don't have the genetics to tolerate that amount of frequency, then you're most likely putting them into a state where injury is more likely, they're more at risk of injury, and then you're going to hurt them before they get to the point where they can actually tolerate that. So that's why I say, if you're not sure what that baseline is, start conservative, build a baseline, and then, because you can always increase, you can always keep going up. But say the athlete gets injured, then it's not just physically hard to pull it back, because you can pull it back, but then you have to start worrying about rehab and making sure that they're able to train relatively pain-free, and then that will present itself as another variable that then you have to consider, because if an athlete is injured, obviously that frequency is going to have to go down. But it's just you're setting yourself up into a position where you're creating more problem with yourself, essentially. But also the mental side of things, because you say you push an athlete with too much frequency at the start, you push them into a state of injury, or they don't see the momentum, or they're feeling burnout, etc. Then obviously not just physically burnout, but mentally that's also going to be taxing on them as well. And that can also, with the psychosocial model and the huge impact that plays, that can disrupt their training momentum. And so obviously you want to always be trying to guide your athlete into a progression. You want to produce momentum out of there with that training. And so in order to get to that momentum safely, basically you want to start conservative and play off your new established guidelines. Now, the next topic that I want to talk about is when you would increase frequency. So say you've got an athlete who's started off benching 2x frequency, when would you start thinking about going to 3x frequency? And so what I'll say in regards to that topic is there are two main criteria that I'll look at when I'm looking for, is this the time to increase frequency? Firstly, I'll look at a strength criteria, and secondly I'll look at a technique criteria. And so what that means is, firstly, in regards to strength, has the athlete milked out as much adaptation and progression as they can out of the current training frequency, and have you explored other variables? So what I mean by that is that frequency is usually the last thing I change, because that is such a big and hard to control variable. And so if an athlete isn't seeing like strength progressions across blocks or during on week-to-week basis, are there other variables look at, say intensity, or maybe volume, sets, reps, or maybe they've got an external variable going on, like a life stressor that's impacting progress. So I would first look at all those other variables before I come down to the last variable of maybe they just need more frequency to induce further adaptation for strength. Now, the second variable that I'll look at that might hint to me that the athlete needs a high frequency is their technique. Maybe their technique's feeling sloppy, or they're feeling detrained, that every week that you've got them on maybe only 1x bench frequency, and that bench frequency every week that they're feeling very sloppy, and quite simply they might just need a secondary or a tertiary bench day so to sustain their exposure, their technique exposure to the movement, so that when the next week rolls around, that they haven't been too detrained, and that they're actually, the body isn't used to the movement pattern. So that's when I might look at increasing frequency, because that technique isn't being sustained, or the athlete is becoming too detrained. And another consideration what I might add is, when you're looking to increase frequency, you always want to play conservative, and you always want to make sure that you're building into that. And what I mean by that is, say even if it might not seem like a big jump, like going from 2x to 3x or 3x to 4x, that is an extra day of training, is still a very big stress that needs to be considered. And you always want to essentially build the athlete's tolerance to make sure that they can sustain that and they can tolerate that. So an example I might give is, say if I've got an athlete currently benching 2x frequency, and I want to bring in a third day, I might not give them a competition specific bench on that third day straight away. I might give them like a dumbbell variation, and then I might progress that into a variation that's less dominant, or it's like a Larson bench where we take the feet out, or I might pull back on the volume, I might pull back on the intensity there, and load cap them that way, just so that third day isn't as big as a shock to the system. And so we can basically, we're always trying to be doing and progressing frequency as safely as we can. So the final topic that I want to talk about is decreasing frequency, and when or in what situations might you start to pull back frequency of an athlete. And straight away, the biggest variable or the biggest consideration that might lead you to start to pull back on frequency is when your athlete is starting to report niggles, aches, pains that's not usually there with training. Is that it's suddenly increased, or it's coming from a variable that you can't correlate, that you can't kind of pick at and see, that it's basically can't be explained. Or if they've got external life stresses that that the athlete has communicated to, that's starting to affect their training and that it's taking a toll. It might be in terms of physical recovery or their ability to stay mentally sharp during the sessions. In those situations, then it might be time to start pulling back frequency, because you get that feeling where if you were to keep the high frequency or whatever frequency that the athlete has been currently running with, if you were to keep running that, then you're starting to increase that risk of injury, and you're also starting to increase the toll or that it takes on an athlete, simply because they don't have the cognitive ability to come in switched on for every session. And as a result, that they're like they're not getting the physical recovery, and so that their body is coming in more fatigued than normal. And so at that point, you're just drastically increasing the potential risk of injury to keep running that frequency. So at that point, it's better to play it safe, so you can keep continuing to build momentum, and then in those situations, it might be a good time to pull back on the frequency. So now that I've talked about kind of how we establish a baseline for frequency, when in situations where would we increase frequency or decrease frequency, the last with this summary, the last thing that I want to talk about is a key. The last thing I want to talk about is the importance of working with your athlete and working around the schedules and life stresses of the athlete, because at the end of the day, we are all human. Specifically to powerlifting, for most people, it's not a paid profession. You don't get paid to compete in powerlifting. It's not a sport that puts money on the table. And so we all live lives. Most people, they'll be working a 9-to-5 job. They'll have other commitments, whether it be study or family commitments or relationship commitments. And so, and even with work commitments, you might have an athlete that's a pilot, or they might be traveling to rural areas for work. And basically, at the end of the day, you're providing a service for them, and your job is to make sure that whatever parameters or whatever variables you have to work around for the athlete, that it doesn't matter what these parameters are. The athlete gives you the parameters. It's your job as the coach to make sure that you turn these parameters and shape them into a way that is most effective for the athlete, regardless of whatever these parameters are. And so that's why it's so important that regardless of what these variables are, you want to make sure that when you're looking to program frequency and deciding what frequency to give the athlete, that it's the biggest variable that you need to consider is it sustainable for the athlete, and is it realistic? Because say if you're deciding between giving an athlete even just 3 days of training or 4 days of training, you would much rather see the athlete consistently hit 3 days week to week and not have missed sessions, be able to hit that consistently, than giving an athlete trying to force 4 days on them in a situation where there might be, like, every week or so you might get a text saying that they were unable to get the 4th day in. Because when you start to see those missed sessions, they add up over time. But most important is that they skew the data, they skew the information that you're collecting off the block. Because, for example, if you've got you're running the 4 days and you've got a missed day, then you've got an extra day of recovery that might produce greater progressions in the following week. But then that 4th day might suddenly come back, the athlete might be able to do that 4th day, and then now you've got an extra fatigue day that it's hard to account for when looking at the effectiveness of protocols. So that's why I would always say that it's much more effective to run a low amount of frequency but be able to hit that consistently week in, week out, than try to force more days than what the athlete is capable of. So that's all from me today, guys. Hopefully that was helpful for you, and I'll catch you guys next time. Take care.